Yeah, thank you for inviting me. So my name is Sophie Falsini. I work as a desk officer for cooperation and development for the permanent representation of Austria to the European Union. My book, with the title The Euromaidan's Effect on Civil Society, how and why social capital increased after the revolution of dignity and the conflict in the east of Ukraine. So this book basically follows the desire to analyze the current state of Ukrainian civil society after the events which have been shaking the country since the end of 2013, beginning 2014, and which, in my view, contributed to reshape the structure of Ukrainian civil society. And I decided to look at this issue through the lenses of social capital because this gave me the possibility to analyze this new wave of social relations, this new structure of society, and the way social capital can actually be important in the development of a society. And I looked at the issue using a multidimensional approach. So I alterned theoretical and empirical analysis. And I did so focusing on the one hand on the theory of civil society as such and the theory of social capital. And also the empirical analysis, I basically interviewed 12 civil society organizations located in Ukraine, in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk. And I tried to see whether I could, through my questionnaire, find out how the level of social capital changed, and whether this could have impacted the structure of society and the role of civil society in the country. As for civil society, there are many definitions of social capital according to different authors, and I think the authors contributing to its conceptualization are, for example, Putnam or Coleman and Bourdieu. But in my book, I basically took the definition of social capital by Lin Nan, and I'm also explaining why. So the definition of social capital is resources embedding in a social structure which can be accessed or mobilized in purposive actions. So here the idea is that society is based on resources which could, if invested, generate some profit for those who do that. And the resources are seen as valuable goods in a society and, for example, contribute to power, wealth, and reputation. But important is that people who have these resources are able to invest them in social networks, and the more social networks are created, the more social capital there is in society. And of course, social networks can be very different, and it's really analyzing the structure of social network which gives us an understanding of how strong maybe also these links are. And for example, we can encounter closed or dense social networks, basically, which see majority of people within them who share maybe the same interests, who have high level of interactions, and in some sense who share more bonding or binding relations among them. Or on the other hand, we can have more sparse or expanded networks where we have a more heterogeneity of actors and also heterogeneity of resources. And in that sense, I think it's important. This is especially important for Ukraine, and because it comes out also of my findings. But the idea that more heterogeneous networks kind of give out more social capital because of the heterogeneousness of resources, and out of more different resources, we can actually have a greater impact. And of course, I think what is interesting for me, it was especially interesting from Lin's theory, is that despite of the levels of network, despite of the type of network we're looking at, all types of social interaction are actually important. and the absence of interaction is the problem. And that was especially important to me and for my theory, because I was looking at how social relations changed, and looking at it networks was really important. And I will also more go into that later, but also the distinction between a binding network rather than a bridging network is essential. And actually Ukraine, I will spoil that now, but Ukraine actually shows more bridging social networks rather than bonding one, because of this great heterogeneity of people. And we saw it already during the Maidan. So many people, so with different also values, different nationalities, also language at some point, which come together for and want to do something and to invest their resources for the benefit of the public good. And that is essential. So a part of resources and the networks of societies is also important for resources to be profitable, that they are entrenched in a definite social structure. And that is important also, and it came out also of the interviews which I conducted, where, for example, civil society organizations told me that without a social structure, actually their actions were not that successful, and they could not develop as they wished, because they needed some kind of organizational structure and a social definite structure which would, bring all the resources together and in some sense, hierarchically relate resources one to another, share and give some rules, and create also a platform for where values could be shared. And in that sense, Lean's theory of social capital is different from the others, because he really puts some accents of the importance of social relations and their networks. And I believe this was especially important for Ukraine, because it's not only about a new definition of civil society we're looking at, but it's about really a new structure of society, and a new structure also come out through new ways of interacting with each other and new ways of looking at the network and the links among different groups. I have traveled to Ukraine, to North, South, and Eastern Ukraine, and then I identified in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk the areas where I would have conducted my interviews, because of the high amount of civil society organizations active there, mostly working with IDPs. And I interviewed 12 civil society organizations. I conducted semi-structured interviews with them in both Russian and English, according to the language they were more comfortable with. And the idea was basically I asked them open, closed, rating and ranking questions. So it was really different, in order to highlight all the different aspects of civil society, but also of social capital. And maybe I just quickly go back to why Lean's theory of social capital was important, is that it gave me the possibility to structure my research, having those indicators through which I could systematize my research. And in fact, I realized a questionnaire of 25, made of 25 questions. And I kind of structured this questionnaire around the main categories of social capital. And for example, on the way of social networks, so whether there was still mistrust in society, disappointment, or how society cooperates with the state or not, the level of resources they had, or their future trends, or so for example, how they worked with media, and how was the level of communication among them, whether they were more heterogeneous or homogeneous actors within civil society organizations. So I tried really to break down the concept of social capital and to make it applicable to civil society in Ukraine. And so exactly, I interviewed different type of organizations, and this is also why in the book I kind of give a more encompassing analysis. I mean, I give a more encompassing definition of civil society because, I mean, as we know, as for social capital, there are many different definitions of civil society, more broad or more narrow. And I looked really for the broadest definition of civil society because I was not only looking to NGOs, but also to social movements, to religious organizations. So everything I could find which could give me kind of an overview of what was happening. And I also analyzed, both older and newer civil society organizations because this could give me a sense of what changed before and after Euromaidan. And also from 2014 to 2016, because we see a kind of improvement and there is a trend, there is a development, and that was also very useful to analyze. And maybe last aspect, the civil society organizations I interviewed changed in size, so they were really different in their size. I, for example, interviewed smaller and bigger organizations, and the thing in Ukraine at that time was that the size of the organization changed according to the funding they had at that time. So if they had funding and if there were projects going on, they may not only have, the organization would have increased in their numbers, and there wouldn't only be volunteers, but also, normal employees. While, 1 week later, after the project was finished, maybe they wouldn't have had that much funding. So employees would have been replaced by volunteers, and volunteers would have been maybe less than the week before. So it was really, not a stable situations I was looking at, and that was also really interesting to see. Of course, there was a development of civil society from 2014 to years later, because, for example, at the beginning, we saw, really people who are unstructured and who come together, and at the beginning there are not that many funds, and the access to resources is really low. And however, on the other hand, this humanitarian crisis, which was triggered by the mainly the annexation of Crimea and the war in the east, and the high flow of refugees, brought many international donors and organizations to Ukraine. Of course, I mean, at the beginning, this was the reason why many organizations, which were very small and unstructured and unprofessionalized at the beginning, started to grow. But at the same time, their structure, I mean, how they were conceived to be, this element was not improving. And they were telling me, for example, yes, at the beginning, we were doing great. We were having so many projects we were working on, but at the same time, not having a clear structure made our work really difficult. So we were not able to communicate properly with each other. We were not cooperating also with other organizations, not only working on IDP. So that was really a problem. And this is also, in some sense related to the fact that external donors sometimes did not have clearly in mind what was happening on the ground. I mean, of course, they knew that they were, helping civil society and helping IDPs, but what they were not clear about what civil society really needed. So it was not only, food packages or hygiene articles, but it was like maybe legal assistance or programs fostering integration of IDPs into society, and all of that was missing and was lacking. And it was only like after some time that civil society organization actually started to professionalize, not only because of the funds, but also because of the experience they had after 1 or 2 years after the start of the revolution. And that was essential, because they understood how qualitative social networks could help them. And they started, for example, to work with other organizations in the same city, in the same region around Ukraine, but also with the organizations which were not focusing on IDPs. For example, some organization told me about their project with, for example, architects when it comes to, providing housing to IDPs, or projects with organizations which provide more legal assistance, or with psychologists. I mean, many psychologists were needed at that time with children, with, you know, people in distress. So, and in that sense, there was a clear development and a clear evolution of civil society and the way also they conceived themselves. And of course, then there is another problem related to the fact that, you know, funding, one day you have funding and the other day you don't you have not. And that was also related to prioritization. So at the beginning, you know, these civil society organizations received many funding, and international organizations were present. But then, you know, the crisis started to shift from central, for example, Ukraine, more to the east. So also this funding actually went more to organizations which were still settled in the east, and those organizations were, of course, less and less because of the war. So it, I mean, the result was that those organizations who used to receive funding, for example, based in Kharkiv or in Dnipropetrovsk, who are still in this but not in, you know, in the hot area, they received less funding than the previous year. And that, of course, caused the interruption of some activities, or the fact that they had to increase the number of volunteers and to decrease the number of employees. And this is a trend which is kind of going on also. And this is maybe worrying because you know, it may be that in 2 years from now, as the IDP's crisis loses its relevance, that also organizations there wouldn't have that much funding, and that may hamper the development of civil society in Ukraine as such, or the development of the country. So that, I think, is a bit of a worrying trend when it comes to funding and to relation with international donors. I mean, there was a difference between, you know, the first months of 2014 and then what was happening after. I can't say, like, I can't tell you, like, from you know, January till March, the situation was like that, and then it changed. But what I felt is that during the Euromaidan, for example, there were still elements which were actually present already in post-communist Ukraine. So basically the fact that informal networks were still much more important than, you know, broader networks, because also agreeing to the interviewees, they told me that the thing is that their families or their friends were there and were going to the streets and were becoming more active, triggered also their interest into their countries and triggered their social mobilization. So informal networks were still present at the beginning, and they were not that present afterwards, because people, and kind of that is my feeling, changed from being publicly passive and privately active into being both privately and publicly active. And also, you know, in the first months and the Euromaidan, there was the mistrust and the disappointment towards governmental institution and the state in general was really high. And this triggered people to activate. And this is actually a really new element, because if we look at civil society in Ukraine many years back, it was not like that, because people were such disappointed and they mistrusted their government, the government, that they really didn't want to invest in their country anymore. But now, with the Euromaidan revolution, they use this anger and the disappointment and the mistrust they saw in the government to really do something. And I think that's actually a defining change, which wasn't present before, and which made me really think that something was happening. And of course, then 2 years after, the situation changed. Of course, people are still sometimes to some extent mistrusting the state, or disappointment because of, you know, reforms which are not good as they have been promised to be. But there's also a really like a high number of organizations which actually try to cooperate with the state. They still are kind of, taking states' duties, and they're actually taking much of what the state should have been doing. They are doing themselves, but on the other hand, they are still looking for ways of cooperation and ways of contributing to the state, and they are kind of more complementary to the state, or they try to be complementary to the state. That does not mean that they are not critical, of course, towards not efficient reforms or a state which sometimes, and that was also coming from the interviews, seems to be not interested or only interested in those issues which could be made public. Or, but however, this was, I think, a great development. Which really was unexpected to me to see. Well, they were surprising discoveries, and this is why also my book kept getting longer and longer, and both from the theoretical side actually and from the empirical side. So on the theoretical side, I actually started to also look, write the book because I was familiar with the theory of weak civil society in post-communist Europe by Howard. And the idea that, civil society in post-communist Europe is weak because of the Soviet legacy and because of the effects of Soviet Union on the development of civil society. However, I was, had these theories in mind, and then I was looking at civil society in Ukraine, and I couldn't see a link between those two, because I was feeling that maybe those theories pleading for a weak civil society in post-communist Europe were not applicable to Ukraine. And that was, I think, my first discovery, the fact that also looking back at Ukraine's history, Ukraine's civil society was actually always there. The problem is that it was maybe not that active. It was a proto form of a civil society, and it was mainly informal. So maybe among family and close friends, but it was there. So the idea that civil society was not there was to me false, or at least not false, but not applicable to Ukraine. And that made me think that actually maybe what was weak in that sense in post-communist Ukraine was not civil society as such, but social capital. So the fact that there were most informal or weak social relations, and there was no access to valuable resources. There was no social structure. Actually hampered the rise of social capital rather than civil society, because of course social capital needs resources to be invested in a society, and that of course was impossible at the time. So that for me was, I think, the one big discovery. So and then looking at the empirical side, the fact that civil society organizations changed also from 2014 to 2016. I thought it was, the idea that through volunteers you can actually achieve some change was to me unexpected. And I looked at what I was seeing in Europe, where many civil society organizations are there, and of course there are volunteers, but not that many. The size of volunteers and how they contributed to the change of society in Ukraine was mind-blowing. And I talked to civil society organizations, and were people telling me that they have been working full-time in those organizations for more than 2 years. And so on the one hand, I was thinking, this is great. On the other hand, I was thinking, could something like that be happening into my country, for example? So the energy those people put in fostering change, and the energy they put in helping people was really pleasant to see. and of course, a very positive discovery. First of all, I was made clearer the importance, for example, of international donors and international organizations helping Ukraine and helping civil society in the country. But at the same time, I think international cooperation in general should be kind of rephrased or restructured in a way that is really, in that sense, Ukrainian tailored but country specific. And that was one of, I think, the major outcomes of my research. So showing me that international cooperation is fine, but international cooperation which is not tailored to the country it's investing in is, of course, may have also some negative effects. And I think that should be also brought into the really political debate, also because we do have so many crises today we have to react on, and the importance of also a really tight collaboration between international donors or international organizations and local ones and local civil society is essential. So the fact that civil society, they really know what they need, they really know what their problems are, and they can also deliver, concrete responses maybe. And I think a close collaboration would be really, really interesting and essential also for the future, because it's not only about money. I mean, money comes and goes, but it's about really structured and well thought projects which are essential in that moment, in that specific region. And of course, and that also came out from my research, and I guess this could be also a topic which could be thematized. The idea that we could not, we should avoid generalizing. I brought this idea out of my analysis of Howard's theory of weak civil society in post-communist Europe. The idea that what he found in Western and Eastern Germany and in Russia cannot actually be applied to whole post-communist European countries, because there are so many and each country has its own specificity and its identity. And I guess really, again, we come back to being tailored to the country you're working on and not generalizing just for the sake of, creating an encompassing theory, because I guess in that sense, maybe I can only, my theory maybe, and what I found couldn't be applied maybe to Western Ukraine. I don't know that. And that's maybe a limiting part of my research. The fact that I only maybe focus on IDPs in Eastern Ukraine doesn't mean that what I found could be applicable to Western Ukraine or to Southern Ukraine. So of course, our research is needed for that. I would like people, so of course, the humanitarian crisis is not an effect we should be proud of, and no one should be proud of the Euromaidan. And there are many, many other negative consequences of Euromaidan. But I think what is positive is that it triggered something, and it triggered people to mobilize and to activate. And actually, and that I also brought, it's some food for thought. I also mentioned in the book, I am not sure whether this social mobilization could have happened without Euromaidan, without war in the East, without the annexation of Crimea, because these are kind of external factors which contributed to the restructuring of civil society in the country. So I may be speculating, I don't know, maybe I don't want to speculate on that, but of course, these were essential for civil society also to understand that change can't come only from the outside, but should come also from the inside. And these also grassroots movements, this generation 2.0 or civil society 2.0, how it was called, was important. And the fact that, and this was also highlighted in one of my interviews, and was really pleasant to hear, that if we want to achieve change, we should be the one initiating it. And that was well understood, I guess, from many civil society organizations, and this is why they proceeded. And also the fact that many things could be done also without resources. Monetary resources, of course. And the fact that you can start trusting civil society organization, or trusting each other, or, just create a kind of a bonding relationship with each other that can be achieved with or without resources. And of course, resources are important, but lacking trust in society is an element which couldn't allow civil society to develop or to improve. I do find two main trends for the future, which are actually really opposite one to the other. So on one hand, I think that if civil society keeps developing as it is and keeps of also gaining, it's also depending on the funds they get, on how they can enlarge their activities, but that civil society organizations I interviewed could be widening their scope. So not only address internally displaced people, which they would continue to do, but also, for example, vulnerable strata of society, people with disabilities, homeless people. They could foster integration in a community. So they would really broaden the scope, and also, the idea of foster integration has been started when I was in Ukraine, and there were many civil society organizations telling me that it was really important for them to move from this humanitarian support to more integration, because, of course, once the crisis is over, you need to give those people a reason to stay and to continue living despite what has happened. So integrating those people in communities is an aspect which will be, I think, also focus for future activities. So as I said, the widening of the scope, and of course, the more civil society organizations become powerful in that sense and stable and gain visibility, the more they can also have an impact on reforms. Of course, they cannot do everything. A social structure also depends on how the state works and how governmental structure interact with each other. But of course, it can create some leverage in one way or the other. However, so the second trend, which is less positive, I guess, but should be mentioned as well, is the fact that as soon as, and I mentioned it before, civil society maybe starts to lose funding, or that the crisis of internally displaced people is not as relevant as it was 2 years ago. So funding would become less, and this would hamper, of course, the development of civil society in the country and the development of Ukraine as such. But I think still that, and on that side, I would finish on a positive note, that given the deep generational change, a deep change in the structure of society, maybe civil society's activities will become less, but still what they have created and what they have achieved so far would remain. And maybe with some shifts, maybe with less, outreach, but I guess civil society now understands how important it is to engage, to support people, create trust, and build social networks. Maybe if you allow me, I don't know, you asked me about the question of how, what I saw and what major change I saw in Ukraine through my discovery, through my analysis. And actually, a very interesting part is also generational change, which I haven't mentioned before. But I think it's worth mentioning because it's one aspect which really triggered change, and also these grassroots movements and new people which have not lived, for example, in Soviet Union and are, for example, not that mistrustful and towards state institutions. So really some new energy coming from below. I think that was essential as well. And actually, that of generational change is one of the aspects which also Howard understands and as one possible way of creating change. However, he's much more skeptical than I am, or he was much more skeptical than I am. But yeah, that in Ukraine was, of course, essential.